Moderating our final panel today is Bonnie Nadell, president of the Hill Nadell Literary Agency. She became David Foster Wallace's agent in 1985 and has represented all of his books since. I'll also add that she was truly instrumental in the development of this symposium, and we're deeply grateful to her for that. I'm very pleased to welcome Bonnie Nadell.
Also here. And then I want to bring up our panelists, who are Deborah Treisman and Bill Tonelli and Colin Harrison. And once everybody's up here, I'll explain who everybody is. Right, we'll put you here, I guess. We hadn't planned this part. David's stories and essays are, for a lot of people, the way into his work. One might even call them the starter Wallace. So if you're not ready to tackle Infinite Jest or The Pale King, these are the ways that you would read his work. And these three editors were instrumental in bringing his work to the magazine pages. Deborah Treisman is fiction editor of The New Yorker. When I first met Deborah, she was managing editor of Grand Street. Colin Harrison was editor of Harper's Magazine when I first met him, and is a executive editor at Scribner. Good enough. And Bill Tonelli was at Esquire when I first met him, and then was at Rolling Stone when he was working with David on various pieces. So all three of these editors are, we've all known each other for a while. They all know each other to some extent or another. And I was going to start with Colin, because Colin did some of the first essays with David. The first one that probably is well known is called Ticket to the Fair, which is about the Illinois State Fair. And my first question to you is, whose idea was this? How did this state fair come about?
It was my idea, but I don't know why I had that idea. I think that David had some fiction in the magazine, and something about him as a Midwestern sensibility had stuck in my head. And somehow I became aware of the fact that there was going to be an Illinois State Fair. Who knows how I found that out. And just the sort of little piece of, you know, the neuron connected to the neuron, I thought, might be interesting to send David Wallace to the State Fair and see what happened, and what would happen. And at the time, it was a good time for magazines back then. Magazines were fat, and there was no internet really to compete with magazines yet. And I don't know, did I call you up, or I called him up and said, how about this? And we commissioned probably a 6,000 word piece, and he sent in this enormous piece of writing. 45,000 words, I don't know, something huge. And I remember thinking, wow, this is fabulous. And I took it to the editor of the magazine, Louis Lapham, and he read it. He thought it was terrific. And then the problem was, how do we get it into the magazine? Because it was not a magazine piece at that point. It was a small planet. And we, you know, I think I probably called up David and I said, look, David, this is great. We love it, but we have to cut it. And he probably made some sad noises, and we got to work on cutting it. And I frankly don't remember if I cut it first and he did a recut, or whether he cut it. But we worked on it, and we had to take some stuff out that was good, but we also had to give it a shape so that it would work in that kind of magazine space. And I think it worked. It was, of course, exciting to do.
And the voice of that Ticket to the Fair piece is sort of, I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's like Woody Allen going to the State Fair, but it's a particular voice. And then the next piece you and David did together was Shipping Out. Mm-hmm. How do you think that voice evolved? Like, how do you think David got that voice, and how do you think the two voices were different from each other?
Well, in the State Fair piece, he very self-consciously mocks himself as a reporter and talks about getting press credentials. He's very excited about that. And he thinks that he should be having a press pass in his fedora or something. And he sort of mocks the regular press that is there to cover this not so special event. And he also mocks the East Coast magazine editor's sensibility that has sent him there.
Perhaps even yours.
Perhaps. So he was having it every which way. And I felt a little sandpapered by that, but I got over it and enjoyed it. And it certainly did set up the voice, though, for the piece, which is, of course, highly self-conscious and anxious. And I think then to follow on in the piece about the cruise ship, there was no self-conscious constructing of a journalistic persona. By then, he'd done enough pieces that he had, license to go do what he wanted to do and go looking for all the stuff that he found. And I find the voice in the cruise ship piece darker than the voice in the State Fair piece. I think that the ending, the conclusion is darker. It's more about death, and whereas the State Fair piece, I think, is more about communion.
Right. I mean, we were talking about that earlier today, where you pointed out the line where he says, "I feel happy here."
Yeah.
And he's talking about sort of being in the cow barn.
Right.
And it smells like cows. But that then in the shipping out, it's sort of how we amuse ourselves to death.
Right. I mean, how many times did David Wallace write "I feel happy" in all of his prose? I'm not sure how many times.
Right. I can't think of another.
Yeah.
And then Deborah, you started working with David when you were at Grand Street and started doing fiction with him. And this is sort of a question which I'll ask all of you, of course, is what was it like to work with him on these first pieces? And what is it like to work with a writer who is so clear about what he wants to do? I mean, as an agent, every time anyone would ask David to write a piece, or I'd be like, he writes long, which is about like the understatement of the year. It's like it's a little cold in the Arctic. And so I know those were the first pieces out of Infinite Jest and Stories. And what was it like when you first started seeing those, and what?
Right. I mean, it was interesting. I would have first been in touch with him around '94, I think, and he had published I think already at least one piece from Infinite Jest in progress in Grand Street before I'd gotten there, and so at some point he came to New York, and I think we had dinner and just talked generally about fiction, and then he sent some possible. I mean, the way he worked with Infinite Jest is, as he was writing it, he would periodically parcel out some small pieces of it and send these off to magazines as not, he didn't call them stories, he was clear about what they were, but to run as stories. And so I remember he sent a few pieces, and we took one of them, and I think, my editing relationship with him on fiction, which is all I worked on with him, and ultimately kind of evolved over time. I think that the very first time was sort of our trial by fire, and he I think needed to get to a point with an editor where he trusted. And so the first time he never knew what he was getting into, and he was, probably, I've worked with some people who are very, very precise about what they want in their work, but he was probably the most precise and the most sort of obsessed with the tiniest details of the syntax, to the point where when he would send in a manuscript, almost always he would have this little thing at the top saying ***, NB, all non-standard syntax is intentional, just in case you didn't get it. So I felt the first time of working on something, we were sort of feeling each other out, and I was feeling out what kinds of suggestions I could make that would be helpful, and what he wanted, what was helpful to him, and then I think that went well. And then after that, it became a much more easygoing editorial relationship where he would send a story, and if I was going to end up running it, whether at Grand Street or in the New Yorker, then we would go to work on it, and there would be endless backs and forths, and each tiny little thing would be discussed at length. But it was an unusual. In the beginning, it was an unusual form of communication because, at least in the 90s, he was such an intensely private person and very paranoid about people getting in touch with him, and he was very protective, for instance, of his phone number. And only if trusted few people seemed to be allowed to have his phone number or his address. And then when you would communicate with him by phone, usually he didn't pick up the phone. So, so you would get we had extended communications via answering machine. This was even pre-voicemail, where I would leave a very long message about everything I was suggesting for a story, and then he would sort of call back at 2 in the morning.
Right.
He knew there was nobody in the office. I mean, it was clear avoidance of actually having to discuss it face to face or voice to voice. And he would leave it, a half-hour message going over each point that he clearly sat down and prepared for. And I'd have to go in the morning and press play and take notes on the proof. And so it was very funny. It was, when I moved to the New Yorker and I had his phone number, I was the deputy fiction editor, and Bill Buford was the fiction editor at the time. And I remember he wanted to talk to David about something, and I was so paranoid about the phone number. I actually went into Bill's office and dialed, because if David found out I'd handed out his phone number to anyone, that would have been the end of it for us. He relaxed a lot more later, and that sort of anxiety level decreased.
Right. I mean, I remember it's like I would leave messages and it would be like, okay, call me back if you want to do this. Actually, call me back whether you want to do it or not, so that I'll know that you heard the message. He was the king of the 2 a.m. leave a message when no one's there. Colin, did he actually used to talk to you on the phone?
Yeah, we did talk on the phone, and we did a lot of editing on the phone. And so these are some long phone calls because we would go over lots of stuff, and little stuff, and sometimes we'd have insanely ornate conversations about the smallest thing, and of course with both of those long pieces we had to cut them, and cutting a piece is complicated, especially in a magazine space where you have to make the footnotes work on the same column beneath the text and so forth. So we had to cut text in order to accommodate footnotes, and it was a fairly technical magazine edit as well as just editing the language. And I remember at one point feeling that we were sort of going back and forth, and I didn't really there was something I wasn't getting about working with him, and he was, I think he may have been in the office. We were working on the ending of one of those 2 pieces. And I happened to watch him walk down the hall on the way to the men's room. And I had just turned the corner from something. I was always doing something else too. And I happened to just watch him walk. And I realized that he was an athlete by the way he was walking. And he didn't necessarily present that way. He had the bandana and the T-shirt and so forth, but he had this sort of bearish walk, and I realized that was how I was going to have to work with him, because he was competitive. And it wasn't necessarily that he was competitive with me, it was just that he was competitive with whatever highest standard of the universe he was able to imagine for himself. And that was helpful. I mean, I understood how really haunted he was by the idea of trying to be as good as possible. And after that, it worked a little bit better. And I won some, he won some. It worked, but it was kind of exhilarating to work with him because you knew that you were going to be working with someone who you really had to be at the top of your game.
Right, sort of like playing a tennis match.
Exactly.
Right, and Bill, when you were at Rolling Stone and doing these pieces, I remember David was probably the last person not to have a computer, and the McCain essays had to be done, it was on a very tight deadline, and that he was faxing things from somewhere in Illinois in the middle of the night. Do you,
I remember, well, the whole thing was a complicated and rushed situation where we'd asked him if he would do, we'd asked him and other writers if they would each do one candidate. That was going to be this kind of big, ambitious way to cover the campaign in 2000. And he responded, he said yes, and said that he wanted to do John McCain, which is great. All the other writers ultimately flaked out and never did any of the things that they were supposed to do, which is part of the course. McCain looked like a candidate and then suddenly stopped looking like a candidate. And so we were kind of pulling back on actually sending David, because we didn't want to spend the money, obviously, to send him and to really officially assign the piece. And it was complicated because he needed to find a dog sitter. He had a dog with some emotional
issues.
And so it was a very particular dog sitter that had to be lined up before he could leave.
Yes.
And so we could have everything else ready to fly him to wherever it was he had to go and have his spot open on the bus. But the dog sitter thing had to be lined up first. And then suddenly McCain won, I guess, New Hampshire. He beat Bush, to everyone's surprise, and suddenly he looked like a real candidate. And so we had to rush David and rush the dog sitter into action to get David on the bus for that week. And so he did the piece. Then somehow between his week on the bus and when he's finished writing the piece, McCain's candidacy starts to fall apart. So now we're not sure if we even want the piece.
Right.
But he's still charging ahead on it. And then I think he finally decided that we were going to do it. And I think on Tuesday morning, or Tuesday around noon, he faxed me a 27,000 word version.
No. And was this on Super Tuesday, or this was before Super Tuesday?
No, Super Tuesday falls in somewhere in here, because then McCain, I think Super Tuesday falls later, because then McCain suddenly dies, and that's when Jan kills the piece. But before that, he turns it a 27,000 word piece, faxed, with no margins, so to somehow try to disguise the fact that it's 27,000 words. Because it's many fewer pages than 27,000 words should be.
Very small type, very small type font too.
It was, I don't know, was it a font? Or was
Must
it
have
just
got like
weird
7,000 words a page.
There was no space on anything. It was really just literally a solid
Just
block
words.
of
Right.
words.
Right.
And so he faxed it in, and we had a team of interns or whoever typing this thing into the system.
Right, because you all were already on computer.
Oh yeah,
Right,
this was 2000.
This was 2000, right. There's this thing, it's called the internet, you scan things, right, exactly.
Yeah, but we closed a 14,000 word piece on Friday. He turned that in on Tuesday. So Tuesday night I took it home and cut it in half. And Wednesday morning we started, rolling. I've worked on magazines that have been very sensitive to writers and to the writer's prerogative, to the writer's point of view in terms of stories, but Rolling Stone was not really among those. And so when you go in Rolling Stone, you entered into the maw. And so, things had to happen fast, almost like a newspaper, really, more than a magazine in a lot of ways. And so from Wednesday morning until Friday night, we were on the phone, either he and I or he and the fact checker were on the phone virtually, all our
Non-stop?
waking hours.
Right.
Yeah. And it was the same kind of situation where the edit, we went through every single change, even if it was a change of punctuation, if it was the question of a comma or not a comma, or capitalization, his weird pattern of capitalizations in this or not. And every change was extremely pleasant, extremely generous, extremely, cooperative and all this stuff. I talked to the fact checker the other day about this, and he said that David was one of the writers who he'll remember as being completely helpful and having no attitude, no big writer attitude, where lots of lesser writers were the ones who gave the fact checkers the hardest times.
Right, but despite all this, all of you have worked with a great number of writers. Is this normal, this kind of attention to detail? Have you had this with other people?
I'll begin our answer, and I'll say that what was very clear about David is the level of professionalism was so high that, when his manuscripts came to us, and I imagine for the two of you, there was literally no grammatical error, no mistake, nothing. There was literally nothing that you could fault in that respect. Or you could talk about cutting and changing stuff, but he had, it was ice perfect, and of course the writing was so fabulous that you knew you were dealing with someone who was very special and wanted to be equal to that person. So I don't think any of us really minded, this kind
No,
of labor.
It made your job. It made you look
Yeah,
good.
it was exciting. Yeah.
Right, and I know, Bill, in the McCain piece in particular, and I know this is true of several editors, where you had to go to the mat because it was when McCain essentially had lost 2000 and Bush was clearly going to win, and I vaguely recall you had to have some fights to.
Well, we killed the piece. Jan Wenner,
Right,
who's
Jan Wenner, who's the editor,
of the Republic,
owner,
killed the
right.
piece because at this point it seemed ridiculous to run a huge story about a guy who was not going to win, was not even really a real candidate at that point. So why are we devoting all this space and all these pages to this guy? And then he showed it to Terry McDonald, who had once upon a time had been one of the top editors at Newsweek and was also working for Wenner at the time. And Terry said, yeah, I agree. Why run it now? So all the grown-ups were against, running it. But I don't know. I think Jan just likes to argue, and at some point he gets bored by the argument. He gets bored of talking to editors.
Right, and you kept
So he
fighting.
says, yeah. So as long as you can chew his ear long enough, you can win.
And then after that, after September 11th, you assigned him a piece called The View from Mrs. Thompson's, or it became called The View from Mrs. Thompson's. It was about.
We were doing a special issue, and so we just, called everybody who we wanted in it. And I'm trying to call him directly. I'm sure I contacted him through you, as was the usual drop. I just wanted to, kind of slightly apropos of that, is the fact that in the entire time of our, it's not really a relationship, we had kind of short, intense bursts of continuous contact. But he only referred to me as Mr. Tonelli.
Yes. At the beginning, did he refer to you as Ms. Treisman?
When I met him, I was 23 or 24, so I don't think he did. But he certainly was very, maybe Miss Treisman.
Right.
He was certainly very courtly, and as to deal with as a writer, he was always very open and generous and very, very polite, which doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with his pickiness about the actual editing.
Right, because you always were Mr. Tonelli in every letter.
You know what?
So-
I mean, and again, especially in a place like Rolling Stone, which is extremely casual, and the lowliest intern calls Jan. And here suddenly was this guy who insisted on. I thought that you're right, that it was courtly in a way, but it was also something distancing about it. It was kind of like a weird, the only other person I know of who ever did that was Elvis. I know early, at least in his life, would always refer to people by Mr. or Miss, and would never call people by their first names. Even when he was Elvis, he was a big, but it was always Mr. And I think now, kind of looking back, obviously everybody, you have to look back through all of it and say this was this kind of weird wall.
Do you think it was that, or do you think it was
Yeah.
Midwestern politeness?
Nah, I think it was a weird wall. I edited a million writers from the Midwest.
They don't all call you
And
Mr.
people who, weren't fit to whatever, but yeah, I mean, nobody has ever, no writer that I know has ever referred to me as Mr. Tonelli.
Right. Colin, but I mean, I think when we all started, we were young enough that you actually were he didn't call you Mr. Harrison, did he?
That's correct, but I think he called our managing editor, Ellen Rosenbusch, Mrs. Rosenbusch or something like that. And I agree with Bill that it was a way of sort of creating an arm's length transaction with the editorial structure that he had to deal with. And I saw it happen, and it was sort of amusing, and I knew exactly what he was doing, which was to just maintain a little bit of a separation.
Right. And do you feel, as magazine editors over the years, do you feel like there's sort of a David Wallace style that has, both in fiction and nonfiction, that people have sort of imitated and used, and whether it's the use of dialogue or the use of sort of, or sort of all the various, his whether you want to call them tics or however one refers to them, that there's a style that is now imitated by other writers, used by other writers, in fiction and both nonfiction.
Right. Well, as people have been saying for the last 24 hours, yeah, he's had an enormous influence over fiction, and at the same time is completely inimitable. So anyone who actually tries to directly imitate what he does it less well and looks bad. So it's a conundrum. But I think there's a whole rainbow of books which have taken something from him, or which have learned something from him, or been inspired by something in his writing. I don't think that we would have a heartbreaking work of staggering genius if we hadn't had Infinite Jest. And that's not to say that Dave Eggers wouldn't have been a good writer, but I think Infinite Jest freed up a lot of fiction writers, and that was nonfiction, but it freed up a lot of younger writers to say, I can do these things. I can do something like this. I don't have to follow these rules, which he had already broken. Magazine writing is a little different, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was sort of a moment of high irony, which is people were sort of into irony, and David was certainly at the front end of that. The funny thing is, in talking about all this, if you go back and read the pieces, they still hold up, and the reason they hold up is because he was such an excellent craftsman, fad or trend to the otherwise. And you just look at his eye and his ear. And he could smell stuff, and he had a great vocabulary. He knew the names of things, and he was a very hardworking writer. And in that way, I think he kind of raised the bar for a lot of people, not just people who might overtly imitate him, but people perhaps even older and more sort of traditional reporters who said, gee, I just need to be better because this guy's really good.
And Bill, would you say, I mean, from years of being at Esquire and Rolling Stone, that there became sort of the David Wallace style of, editors saying, I want the David Wallace take on.
Well, certainly, everybody said they wanted David Wallace. I don't know if they wanted, looking for the second or third rank David Foster Wallace, but definitely when Harper's ran the two pieces, the county fair and or the state fair, whatever it was, and the cruise ship, that suddenly then David became the writer that every magazine editor, I'm sure that you are more aware of this than anybody, but he became the writer every magazine, every nonfiction editor wanted to assign.
That's true. And I mean, there were certain pieces that would interest him and other pieces where he just would be like, no, I don't want to do this. I mean, whether it was like, do you want to go to the Academy Awards? No. Do you want to go to, Oxford and go to a conference on language? No. The other thing, which I'm sure all of you know, was David a good traveler? I mean, was he someone who liked to travel? I mean, your story about the dog sitter is emblematic of this. I mean, this is a man who didn't have a passport, I think, till he was about 35 years old. There's certain journalists who, sure, put me on a boat, put me on a train, put me on a plane. I feel like he was not someone who was a big traveler.
As I recall, there was a larger than normal amount of sort of process conversation about getting there, on time. Here's what you need to do. These are the people. I mean, some writers, you can parachute them into the jungle and they'll be drinking tea in the veranda that afternoon. Yeah. And he's not like that. He needed some handling.
I mean, I think that was his whole nonfiction persona, at least. I mean, the title, a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again, really can just stand for everything.
Exactly.
Where he's concerned.
Right. And I mean, certainly for the two of you in doing nonfiction with him, he spent a great deal of time not actually interviewing the people he was supposed to interview.
Right. He hid in the hotel room or whatever the room was. He hid.
Right. Yeah, that was it practically in the contract.
Right.
That you had to understand that he was never actually going to speak with
John McCain, for example.
He was never going to speak with John. And not only was he not going to be able to get to John McCain, but he wasn't really even going to try. And that you knew that the piece was going to be better for the fact that he would never get there.
Right. I mean, because your expectation of most people on a campaign trail and on a bus is that they actually spend the time with the other.
Right, but
with the candidates.
I think that he worked in such a way that he created a McCain-shaped space in the piece, and so that was really the only thing that was left unnoticed by David.
Right.
was that hole that was shaped like John McCain.
Right, the actual man who he was supposed to follow. Right. Right. I mean, I knew this, that like he would go and then not actually go anywhere he was supposed to go. I mean, like when he went on the cruise, did he do any of the activities?
Well,
Or did he just observe?
He called, and I believe he called from the ship, basically saying, "Well, I'm here," as if that was the great accomplishment. and you know, and now what am I supposed to do? And I knew David well enough to know that to be overly directive was completely the wrong thing, because I wanted him to activate his anxieties, because that was the radioactive stuff, the fuel that was powering him, and I also knew that if I was overly prescriptive, he would respond against that. He would push against that. So I said, David, you know, just go and just do it. Write about what you see. Do some stuff. Have fun, and you know, that was unnerving enough that he had to then go out into the ship and discover whatever he would discover. But he did hide in the room quite a bit. And if you go back, there's discussion of how the bed has been made and the fruit has been arranged, and the woman who cleans the room, he never sees her, but he fantasizes about her and so forth. And, you know, he was up to his usual tricks.
Right. I mean, if I remember right, there's like at least 1,000 words on the toilet and how the toilet works on the ship.
Oh, yes. And
which only someone who spends an awful lot of time in a room would think about.
Well, the funny thing is that when he did something like that, he would mine the topic so deeply and down to sort of a philosophical level that it would begin to connect with some of the other observations he made in the piece. And you began to develop, you know, a kind of thematic structure, a unity that paid off. But right, when you're reading, you know, about the mechanics of these vacuum toilets on the cruise ship, you know, why are we here? You know, but he wrote so well that it didn't matter. He would just go with it, you know.
Right. And certainly in the fiction, I mean, it's different because, of course, the power of observation is different. But certainly in the pieces from Infinite Jest that ran in Grand Street and ran in the New Yorker, there are different things about the landscape and about Boston and about the halfway house and all of the different pieces.
There's an intensity of observation. I mean, it's what makes that book come alive is simply the fact that no item of clothing, no little, you know, scar on the ear goes unremarked on, that every single thing is registered and used to create a portrait, which is a psychological portrait as well.
I want to talk a little bit about David as a moral writer, because I think certainly in the McCain piece, which winds up being a lot about like why we should vote, sort of in some ways why the Pale King is sort of why we pay taxes and why it's a good idea. And then The View from Mrs. Thompson's, which is really about the Midwest in 9/11 and how, even though it was very far from New York, what it was like. And sort of what you all think of David as a writer with a really deep moral core and moral sense.
I'll hazard a beginning of the answer. I think that, as has been discussed, he was very acutely aware of the alienation of society and the way that we were all brutalized by whatever you want to call it, modernism, postmodernism, hypo-capitalism, and so forth. And he really did feel that Americans and human beings were damaged animals in our environment, and was trying to make comment on that and save himself or save others from it. And I was rereading the State Fair piece on the plane down here, and I was thinking that the places where he's happiest are when he's confronting genuine innocence, and other times where he's confronting much less than that, he's a little bit more suspicious and ironic and so forth. And there definitely is a moral gathering to his pieces, and he arrives at a moment of moral instruction, but he has entertained you so completely and sort of snuck up on you that you don't feel that you're being preached to or hit over the head, that he's kind of slipped it in the side of your head while you were watching something else. And that, to me, has been one of the pleasures of his work.
I think, you know, it's the salient thing for me in the fiction is that it is he's dealing very often with characters who have done atrocious things, or are doing atrocious things, or are going to do atrocious things, and he manages to write about these things very honestly, and with this kind of sweeping understanding of what is driving these acts, and with a moral sense about them, but without a judgmental sense. It's a very fine line to walk, and it's very hard to look at characters who are laughable and not laugh at them, and to look at characters who are doing bad things and not make them entirely bad. It's very difficult to write about it, and especially to write about it in such a clever way as he did. He was always, everything was clever. There was a sort of it was deeply infused with cleverness, everything that he wrote. And this came up for us actually when I was working with him on a piece that ended up being part of The Pale King, which we called Good People, which was a very short story about one of the characters in Pale King, Lane Dean Jr., who's gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and he's meeting with her, and they're planning to go and get an abortion, and she's having second thoughts, and what I loved about this as a story, which is how I first read it when he sent it to me in I think 2006, was the fact that these characters were fundamentalist Christians. They were praying over their decision. They were even asking, what would Jesus do? All these things which were not his perspective on life, as far as I knew it, but that he managed to present without making us, us privileged atheist New Yorkers, want to make fun of these characters. He did it with so much understanding, and we had a conversation at the time, or an email conversation about the title of this piece. And originally, well, I brought his email about it, so maybe I can, instead of paraphrasing, I'll just tell you what he said. I'd originally had one or two sentences about trees filled with sap in the park to go along with all the not too subtle greenery and bees and general fecundity of springtime, and the piece's title was Sap. I decided that this was craven in a particularly Pomo way, viz. Teasing the reader with the possibility that the title applied to Lane and that the author maybe saw him as sappy, which I suppose I do in some ways, and was sneering at him, which I'm not. So I gave the piece a title in which the possibility of irony, mockery, sneering was much, much more remote, though not, I suppose, impossible. So I said, good idea, good people. And then the next day he writes back, I'm curious how you felt about my little rant about sap, is the initial title. Did it make sense? Do you agree? I myself am now totally confused. Does the title Good People threaten to make the story seem too close to sentimental, especially now with the nakedly cliche heart reference in the final line? So he went back and forth over all of this. And he asked me, do you agree that past a certain line, this taste can turn everything arch and sneering and too ironic? Or do you have your own set of abstract questions to drive yourself nuts with? So he was just always so wonderfully aware of how he was writing from a moral perspective, and of how much he was beholden to his characters to present them in a way that was honest and that wasn't sneering, and yet often made them funny. Often we could laugh at them, but he didn't want it to cross that line into sneering.
Right, absolutely. And though, Bill, certainly in the McCain piece where he's writing about the other journalists, who he refers to as the 12 monkeys.
All right, that's sneering.
Would we say that was, the 12 monkeys being, I imagine, the standard political reporters who are usually on the bus, as they say.
Right, the self-important guys, and they're all guys in blue blazers and blue Oxford cloth shirts, who were always up at the front. We were on the bus number 1, whereas David was stuck on bus number 2 with it was David and the sound technicians.
Right.
On bus number 2. I think he was the only.
He probably chose to go on that bus, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, I guess we choose everything. Yeah, I'm sure that he would have been much more uncomfortable on bus number 1.
Right.
But in terms of the moral, I think that it was interesting because the piece was really about the bullshit of political campaigns all the bullshit, including the journalistic bullshit, obviously, which there's a great deal. But and he at some point even really comes out from behind the curtain and just discusses the fact that given who John McCain was and given how he conducted himself during Vietnam and the prisoner of war camp, even he was as admirable as a person as David could find, at least in politics. Did that mean then that he was, when he said that he was being honest in the Straight Talk Express and all that, was he genuinely being honest? Or had they just realized that honesty was going to be a really good marketing tool to sell more bullshit? And David, I mean, fairly openly, and I think it's unusual for him, and I remember at the time reading it, it almost felt, because he had come out from behind the repertorial shield and was discussing it, even addressing, and you, Rolling Stone reader, who I think he imagined as a kind of an 18-year-old kid voting for the first time, that was that level of innocence or lack of complicity in all this. So is this really true? Is this, so because of whom John McCain can we then say, yes, this is all really true, and this is really the question that it all comes down to? And he almost he sneaks up on the point of saying, yes, this guy must be telling the truth because of who he is, but then he wisely doesn't turn into an endorsement piece. But that's really where that piece, what it all came down to for him once you got past all the,
right, because I mean, I remember
the reporting.
I think a lot of us at that stage were having conversations of politically not agreeing with what John McCain represented, but thinking that he was, at the time, the most admirable candidate in the race.
Well, it was John McCain or Al Gore, really, at that point. They seemed to be, those were going to be your choices.
Right.
So McCain looked 1,000 times better.
Right. Right, and that because I do remember being on the phone and we'd be like, why do we think he's good? Maybe he's, maybe it is the next market. It's like the best marketing tool ever.
Right, is the truth.
Right. And David being on the bus with the sound technicians, the next piece he did after that, which was called Host, which was about a talk radio show in LA, a very virulent and very conservative talk show host. And he spent most of his time with the sound technicians because he was not someone who ever, as we know, spoke to the people in charge. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
He liked the sound techs.
Yeah.
He did.
They probably wore long hair and headbands too, or bandanas too.
Right. And do you feel like when he was doing this piece, did the people on the McCain campaign have any idea who he was?
I think there was probably one or two people in the press office who had a sense who this guy is, or I'm sure it seemed he was pre-Google. But somehow though they figured it out that he was just this kind of literary guy writing for Rolling Stone, which expectations from Rolling Stone were low to begin with in terms of respectability. So it's not as though they really expected a lot from him in that. And they really got, I'm sure when they saw him on day one, they got pretty much what they expected from Rolling Stone.
Right. Right. And I mean, when you sent him on the cruise, I mean, David already had long hair and a bandana. Was it hard to, did you just say we're booking this person on the cruise, or do you even remember how this all went?
I think that we bought the ticket for him, and it was my sense that trying to engage with the sort of the standard public relations or publicity apparatus would be a disaster, and the best thing to do would be just kind of sneak him on, and because he needed to sneak up on the situation, and he was not afraid of being abrasive, at least visually, with people. He wasn't going to rearrange himself to fit into somebody's expectation, and that was part of his way of. It was a stance. It was also alienating people a little bit, but strangely enough, it also created access to other people too, who were less intimidated by him. And at that point, he was a bear that you just let loose in the forest and let do what he wanted to do. And I wasn't going to manage that. I was going to he was a big boy. He needed to figure it out for himself, which he did.
Right. That you. It's funny because I of course would get the phone calls of like, what should I do about I mean, when he was doing the host piece, it was like they told me to go buy dinner, and I'm like, why are you buying dinner for all the people at the radio station? And he was like, well, they told me I should go buy dinner. And he's like, so where should I go? And it was like, and I think I sent him to the Kookaroo, that was nearby. He also was someone who didn't like driving the freeway. So it's really hard to navigate Los Angeles without a freeway. But I think I sort of explained to him how he could get from, not necessarily Claremont because you have to get on a freeway, but how to get to the Kookaroo and then to the radio station to feed the sound techs. And I was like, at that point he was writing for the Atlantic Monthly, and I'm like, I don't think this is really what you need to do, but it was very clear that he was gonna go buy dinner, and my job was to tell him how to get there and how to buy dinner and bring it to the sound techs.
See, but by then, any editor working with David knew that you were in the picture and you were solving some of these problems backstage. So
Right.
you were part of it.
Right, that it's, that he, when in doubt, he would call me and say, like, what do I do about this?
Right.
Or going to the lobster festival and not wanting to eat the lobsters, for example. No. Though he ate all the lobsters. We were talking before this sort of about the idea of when a writer sort of becomes part of a magazine, when David sort of became a Harper's writer, when he became a Rolling Stone writer, when he became a New Yorker fiction writer, and sort of how sort of when you become part of a magazine, what that means, and how sort of you adopt a writer.
Well, again, I'll try to start a response to that question. For David, I think doing the first nonfiction or journalism pieces for Harper's was new for him, and he was freed from the anxieties of writing fiction in the nonfiction space, but he also was going to be packaged in a way that he'd never been packaged before, which is, as someone you tease on the cover, and he gets fact-checked, and we have to, there's a lot of process that goes into being in a magazine, and he's, as Bill was saying beforehand, he's on your team, and whether he likes it or not, he's a part of your team for that issue, and I think that he probably was aware that he was being taken advantage of, in a sense, and that once people knew how talented he was adding value to that particular magazine, but he was also having value added to him by way of the imprimatur of the magazine and the exposure. And he was, one magazine that has hundreds of thousands of readers it accelerates the kind of process of who he was. So there was, it worked both ways, and I guess he got more comfortable with that as time went on.
And Bill, right.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the first piece, he addressed the Rolling Stone reader kind of directly, so I don't think that it was, I don't recall at any point, either of the pieces that he did for Rolling Stone where he had to be shoehorned or his thing had to be changed. I think his Harper's pieces read completely like Harper's pieces, and I think his Rolling Stone pieces, and I presumably he, made, or he just kind of without thinking about it, knew that he was writing for a particular person or a particular thing, and you do have to. I remember the headline for his McCain piece was, I think it was Up Simba or something like that, which none of us could even figure out what it meant. And so we changed it, and he barely complained, and then said he was going to change it back when the thing was republished. We said, fine, go ahead,
Right.
But we didn't use his headline for it, and he didn't, it wasn't a problem.
Right, well, that was like the first title of Shipping Out was a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again.
And I said to him, David, look, I suppose that's a good title for this, but it doesn't work in the magazine space. There's a certain amount of space just on the layout, and then Harper's actually had the titles of the pieces on the jacket, the front of the cover of the magazine, and we had to work inside this format, and so that's just part of the kind of the nudging and the packaging and stuff that took place, and it was clear that he was going along with it. There was kind of an important size at moments on the phone, but he went along with it. He got it.
Did he give you any weird titles, Deborah?
Everything had a weird title, but it was less of an issue for us. But going back to the notion of being, on a team for a magazine, it's different with fiction, obviously, and I don't think that he ever took for granted his status in terms of fiction. Even after he was in the New Yorker's 20 under 40 issue in 1999, every story he sent me, he'd say in the cover letter, I think you have about a 10% chance of wanting to take this. It was very, and I think he honestly believed, I don't think that was false modesty. I think that was, he honestly, felt he was writing what he was writing, and it might not be right for magazines, or might not be right for anyone other than himself. And there was that constant doubt and self-questioning with it.
But I hear that. I think there was a little bit of a dodge in that, because he would do the same thing when he sent in commission pieces. Say, Colin, here's the piece that you.
Well, there probably was only a 10% chance that you would take a 35,000 word piece.
Exactly. but he was, again, it was sort of creating that sort of space for himself, and a little passive aggressive.
Yeah, he's anticipating the worst.
I mean, he
So
knew
that
at some
he
point
can,
that he was David Foster Wallace. Somehow
Right.
the message even got to him that anybody was going to would run it. It would be easy to find, a fairly exalted home for anything that he wrote.
Right,
And yet there was still that kind of weird, fake.
I
humility.
don't actually think it was fake. I think there was a lot of self-doubt every step of the way with him. At least maybe it's different on the nonfiction side.
Right, though the last piece you did with him, Colin, was the one about usage and being a snoot, which actually had been turned down by somewhere that we no longer can remember where.
Right.
But you wound up publishing.
Well, I think you must have called me up and said what he did was too long, and the people didn't get it or didn't understand, and would you take a look at it? And I said yes, and as soon as I started reading, I knew instantly we were going to do this. And in that case, there was none of this negotiation, and it was a finished piece, more or less ready to go.
Yeah, and you were at Esquire when the Michael Joyce piece came.
When details on that one had it's incredible the number of times his stories get killed. But Details assigns a piece to him about this tennis player. I had nothing to do with it even at Esquire, but I just know that. I guess it was long. It was like a 15,000 word piece.
Well, it wasn't actually Detail's style.
Right.
I mean, that was what they said.
Right.
They're like, we can't use this. This is not our style.
But see, it's just to interrupt, the sort of meta conversation happening at the time amongst magazine editors, the way these pieces would sort of blow up magazines, and they would go into a magazine, and it was not a magazine piece that the magazine thought it would ever run, and yet it ran it, and it was good. And I mean, he was, not only was he subverting certain, journalistic forms and even the forms of certain magazine pieces, he was subverting the DNA of certain magazines themselves, which was very cool.
Think about the lobster piece, which he wrote for Gourmet, right?
Best example.
And I remember you at the time calling me and saying, I think there may be a problem because, David was sent to this lobster festival in Maine by Gourmet, and they wanted a piece about it, and now he's written this kind of piece, and we don't think there's a chance in hell they'll want. Maybe you want to look at it,
Right.
because and then they actually did run with it, and it was, their best piece of the year. I mean, it was
Right,
Perfect.
because Gourmet, as it existed, used to have like pages and pages of ads of the Beef Council, the Seafood Council, and if you write a piece that says, is it moral to eat lobster or meat or anything, and PETA thinks this is a great idea, Gourmet was not so happy. There's actually also an editor here, Jay Jennings from Tennis Magazine, where he assigned David a piece about the US Open, and what David wrote was a piece called Democracy and Commerce at the US Open. Which somehow, Jay, where are you? Okay. Did the US Open like that?
But it was, I knew he was going to do that. Thanks to what he'd done for Colin already, I kind of knew what I was getting. And we did have, the Tennis Magazine had a relationship with the USTA, so there was some back and forth, but it was a story we were willing to go to bat for, just because it was so perceptive and acute about the event, and it sort of synthesized all of the conversations that some of us who've been working in tennis for years, and all the complaints that we had voiced about the U.S. Open over, synthesized in this one piece. And I think that was true at the USDA too. They looked at this and said, this is what the event is. And it was amazing that he was able to do that in 3 days over a Labor Day weekend at the U.S. Open. And we got, some criticism, but many more, thanks, but many more compliments about the piece. Maybe because he'd already dealt with Colin, I assigned the piece at 3,500 words, I think, and it came in at 8,000 instead of 15,000. So
You were lucky.
it was still. We were able to run the whole piece, and with the footnotes all in the right place. But it was one of the highlights of my editing career, certainly. And there were top 10 tennis players who were saying that's the best thing I've ever read in Tennis Magazine. And that's when you knew he knew his stuff.
Right. And before we open it up for questions, I suppose the last question to sort of talk about is, which sort of goes back to the idea of David hiding in a room, not interviewing McCain, calling you up and saying, "What should I do?" Is that magazines obviously fact check everything they run, and there are places, particularly in Ticket to the Fair, where, let's say, David's imagination ran away with him a little bit. Perhaps the twirling cheerleaders with the fire breathing.
Baton, yeah.
And sort of as magazine editors, what do you do in a situation where it's so good and it's so fun to read, but it might not necessarily have happened exactly that way?
Well, the magic trick that he was able to pull off is that the pieces did get by the fact checkers. And because the things that could be fact checked were fact checked and they were true. And the things that could not be fact checked, you can neither prove nor disprove. And they were so fabulous that they were true. And
right, it didn't matter.
And the discussion about this will go on for some time. There was one point in the piece where he said that some crack files had fallen out of some kids riding the Zipper, or one of these big rides, and it had fallen on a state trooper who was alertly eating a lemon pop-up at the time. And alertly eating a lemon pop-up was such a Davidism that, maybe it was true, but but I think that the broader point is that he was able to get at something deeper and larger and true, that to pin him against the wall with a kind of narrow-minded sense of what was factually provable would have been very disastrous and a disservice to everybody involved.
And Bill, what was?
I mean, we fact-checked, our fact-checker was with him on the phone almost as much time as I was. And everything that could be fact-checked, and a lot of the pieces, especially the McCain piece, was fact-checked. And if it was, according to our fact-checker, wrong, it was fixed and made right. But I think that David, like all good writers, knows when he can lie and when he can't. And so, there are certain things, obviously, that you can neither prove nor disprove, like what the state troopers eating. And so I think that writers, feel free to take. I mean, the John D'Agata book that's out, or recently published, whatever it's called, Lifespan of a Fact, is kind of an entire, that's the real fact-checking experience where he's got every fact wrong practically.
Oh, right.
And it's the whole dialogue between him and the fact-checker and the editor, kind of glancingly shows up in the piece, and that's kind of, but the fact-checkers checked everything. I think he had one thing in the September 11th piece where there's somebody who's making a flag out of construction paper and crayons, and somehow, which seems to be the kind of thing that is impossible to fact-check, but somehow our fact-checker discovers that it's not true, and that became a problem, and at that point the managing editor got involved, and it almost blew up the piece. And somehow,
Really?
yeah.
Though it's not a fact that actually matters.
Well, all facts matter.
Okay.
But somehow that we discovered, it's kind of like you don't really want to discover that, but because once you discover it, then you have to do something about it. And I think it was one of those moments. Where I'm sure there was lots of stuff that was made up, but he was smart enough to make up the stuff that you're not going to catch him on.
And a lot of the stuff that was unfact-checkable was his internal processes and his, ornate anxieties and feelings about people and so forth. And how do you say, David, you didn't prove to us that you lusted after the woman who was cleaning your room in the ship? I mean, you can't prove that, or disprove it. And so.
Right, or that you felt terrible about saying something to the waiter on the ship, and then you were worried he got in trouble.
Right.
Right.
You can call the pieces journalism, and I think you should, but you can also call them literary performances, and I think that's just as accurate.